be turning to Revelation chapter 12. Revelation chapter 12, that's where we're going to be here this evening in our study of Revelation. Revelation chapter 12. Again, as we've been doing, we want to remind ourselves of the outline of the book, and our rules for following are for studying the book of Revelation, and then we'll get into chapter 12 here tonight. As we study the book of Revelation, we've been reminding ourselves that the theme of the book is about victory in the Lamb. The key verse is chapter 17 and in verse 14, where it says, "These will make war with the Lamb, and the Lamb will overcome them, for he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and those who are with him are called, chosen, and faithful." And as we said, if we get to the end of the book of Revelation, if our biggest takeaways is God is on his throne and in control, and the Lamb will be victorious, we've learned what the heart of the book of Revelation is all about. Now, we've outlined the book into two sections. Chapters 1 through 11, we titled The Conflict on Earth. And so as you go back through what we've studied so far, as we finished that section Sunday morning, those first 11 chapters are really dealing with the fact that those that John is writing to are suffering persecution, and as bad as things look, God is going to come in judgment on their enemy, Rome. We are going to, and we'll get more into this in a minute as we introduce chapter 12, we're taking a little bit of a transition now in chapter 12. We're not done with Rome. We've got to still deal with Rome. Rome hasn't completely fallen yet in the vision. That will happen in a few chapters when Babylon the Great falls as reference to Rome. But starting in chapter 12 and going through the end of the book, it's about the conflict between the Lamb and the dragon. In chapter 12, when we finish chapter 12, we're going to have an understanding as to why there's conflict on earth. Now, 12 to 22 is really dealing with all of that, but chapter 12 itself, just sort of jumping ahead of ourselves for a minute, in verse 17, the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. And so this chapter really begins explaining to them, why is there conflict on earth? Well, that's because ultimately there's conflict between the Lamb and the dragon, or between Christ and Satan. We want to remind ourselves as well of the rules that we've been reminding ourselves of for studying Revelation, that we need to remember the book was written to encourage the people of John's day. That the book is largely symbolic, that it heavily uses Old Testament terminology, that we don't need to press the details of the symbolism, to interpret the book in light of clear biblical passages, and to visualize or picture these visions in our mind. Help us see the picture as John is saying them. And again, as we go back to these rules 1, 2, and 4 in particular, as we've talked about, sometimes there's this possibility, for something, and here's another possibility, but at the end, they both point to the same thing. And so at the end, we need to remember that it's not as much for us today about learning the specifics, though I think we can reach conclusions about that, as we've been trying to do throughout our study, but that we get the main theme, which again is victory in the Lamb. As we mentioned a moment ago, we're getting ready now for the second half of the book. It just so happens when the book was divided into chapters and verses, this book divides in terms of number of chapters perfectly for us. The first 11 have to do with the conflict on earth. The last 11 have to do with the Lamb and the dragon. So again, chapter 12 beginning, we're going to start seeing, we're going to still have things like the two beasts that we'll deal with, Lord willing, on Sunday morning. We're going to come later on and have the bowls of wrath. We're going to come later on and have Babylon the Great, or the great harlot of chapter 17. We're going to have the fall of Babylon in chapter 18, which again, sort of jumping ahead of ourselves, is representative of their enemy, which in this case would be Rome. But while we're going to still deal with that, again, chapter 12 is explaining to us the whole reason. If you sort of take a pause for a second and think about everything that they're going through at this day and time, Domitian is on the throne on earth. He's the one ruling over Rome, and if they don't worship him, what happens? you suffer persecution. It may be prison, it may be economic hardships, it may mean your life, but there's suffering for that. So then in 1 through 11, chapters 2 and 3, we've got the letters to the 7 churches and that introduction in chapter 1. But really starting at chapter 4, and we got the reminder, God's on his throne and in control. Chapter 5, God is going to come on them with the opening of those seals. And chapter 6, seeing the first 6 of those seals being opened, about God coming in judgment there, particularly with the 6th seal. That God's going to protect his people, the sealing of the 144,000 of chapter 7. Then chapter 8 and chapter 9 coming back to the opening of the 7th seal, leading to those 7 trumpets. Then we saw chapter 10 with the angel, the mighty angel and the little book. And then 11, John's told measure the temple, as we talked about Sunday morning. That is, measure those that are my people, showing that I know who are mine, leave the courtyard off outside the temple. That is, those that are not my people. Then he talks about the 2 witnesses, really representing the fact that the gospel was going to go out and be triumphant in the days of Rome. But then what followed that was persecution, but then the resurrection, showing sort of a revival of their cause. And that is, despite the persecution, God is still with them. So now when you finish chapter 11 and that final seal is opened up in chapter 11, and they're praising God because the kingdoms of the world have become the kingdoms of our Lord and of his Christ, and he shall reign forever and ever. Chapter 11:15, the question someone might have at this point is, then why are we suffering? If God is the one in control, and God can come and will come on them in judgment, why at this point is Rome persecuting us, though? Chapter 12 answers that question. That is, the reason there's conflict on earth between those of the heathen powers and between Christians, or between those of the world and between Christianity, is because ultimately there's conflict between the Lamb and between the dragon. So chapter 12, we titled chapter 12, The Woman and the Dragon. We'll get to the woman in a minute. But then we're going to have this really divided into 3 sections. The woman, the male child, and the dragon in 1 to 6. The war in heaven, 7 to 12. And then the persecution of the woman, 11 through 17. I've already referenced verse 17. I think this summarizes the key point of chapter 12. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Now, we're going to get into the details of the chapter in a minute. Who's this woman? Who's the dragon? That one's pretty easy. Who's the male child? That one's also easy. The harder of them is who the woman is. And what do they represent? But let's go to 17 again, the key verse here, and we're sort of going to jump ahead for a minute. We're going to get the conclusion, and here's the conclusion of the chapter. Why is there conflict? Because something caused the dragon to be enraged with the woman and to make war with her offspring. Now, who's the woman? Again, we'll explain more about that in a minute. But chapter 17 is explaining to me why there's conflict on earth, because the dragon, Satan as he's referred to here as well in the chapter, is in conflict with the Lamb and with his people. But let's begin now. 1 to 6, the woman, the male child, and the dragon. As we said, there are, in these first 6 verses, 3 characters that we have to figure out who they are. Our interpretation of the rest of this is going to be contingent upon who these are. And so we'll start with the hardest one, because that one's introduced first, and that is the woman. I'll tell you, the other 2, again, are easy. Christ is the male child, the one born who would caught up to God in his throne, verse 5. And then the devil is the dragon. I know because John told us that specifically in verse 9. That's one of the easier things to figure out here in Revelation. John told us exactly what the dragon represents in verse 9. But who's the woman? Well, there have been a number of views as to who this woman is. And so some have argued that the woman represents the Jewish nation. That doesn't completely fit. Why does that not completely fit? Because we have the woman at the beginning, and if the woman had the male child and that was the end of the woman, then that would fit. Except the Jewish nation as a whole did not what? Except Jesus. Whoever this woman is, there's an association between her and the male child brought up again later in the chapter. Other view is that it represents Mary. That doesn't fit either. We're not looking at a specific woman. Again, we are dealing with symbolic language. Not referring to an actual woman. This woman is representing something. That's a little narrow in what it could be. Another interpretation that is given is that the woman is the church. Now, I think that when you come later on, that is part of what is entailed in the woman later on in the chapter, and I'll give some quotes and stuff on that later on. But I do not think the woman can simply just be, well, here's the church. And why is that? Because where does the male child come from? From the woman. That would mean that Christ came from the church, not the church from Christ, if that's what it represents. So I think Haley's right in his position, which is the woman just simply represents the faithful remnant. I'll go through this quote in a minute. It'll take a few slides, but before we get to that, let's illustrate it this way. Go back to the Old Testament, and you go all the way back to Jacob, and when Joseph is in Egypt. What takes place in the days of Joseph? There is a famine. How are the people preserved? How's the children of Jacob preserved? They go to Egypt where they're given food by Joseph. Joseph tells his brothers later on that you meant it for evil, but God for good, to preserve as it is this day many people alive. God in his providence used Joseph to what? Preserve the line of Abraham. The one who was promised, this one would come through. Let's go forward a little bit later. The people are taken captive, but they are not totally destroyed. Some of them are taken captive, leaving a remnant. In the days of Esther, remember what happens in the book of Esther? Haman tried to destroy the Jews. And so here's one. What's the purpose of the book of Esther? Depending on your translation, and if you have some translations, it and Song of Solomon, are the only two books not to specifically mention God. Yet you see the providence of God all in the book of Esther, because what happens in Esther? He's using her to do what? Save his people, save the line through which the Christ is going to come. So I think what the woman represents is that faithful remnant. Haley says the woman seems not to be the Jewish nation, a view held by some. Neither is she the church in its general New Testament sense, as suggested by others, nor could she be the Virgin Mary, as contended by a third group. The Jewish nation rejected the Christ. The church, in its limited or New Testament concept, is the product of his redemptive work. And to make her the Virgin Mary is entirely too limited in scope. The woman can best be thought of as the spiritual remnant of God's people who in faithfulness had kept covenant with him. This position is sustained by Micah, who said, "Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail. For now shalt thou go forth out of the city, and shalt dwell in the field, and shalt come even unto Babel, and there thou shalt be rescued. There will Jehovah redeem thee from the hand of thine enemies." Micah 4:10. So according to Micah, the nation would be given up until the time that she who travaileth, the remnant, the daughter of Zion, hath brought forth. The one brought forth by the travailing daughter of Zion should be the ruler in Israel, the Messiah king for whom the people looked, Micah 5:2 through the end of the chapter. Likewise, Isaiah identifies the bearer of the man-child as the spiritual remnant of Zion, emphasizing the birth of both the man-child and the new nation that would come through him, Isaiah 66:7 through the end of the chapter. It was through this faithful remnant that the man-child was born and the new spiritual nation brought forth. So again, now it's a quote, but when we sort of take everything that Haley said there in his commentary, by the way, if you have his commentary, you can find that on pages 268 and 269. The point that the woman here, again, doesn't represent the church. I think the church would be included in that in the latter half. I'll get to that in a minute. but it represents the faithful remnant of Israel used to preserve that line through who the Christ would come. And you can take, again, how that term about the woman travaileth is used in Micah 4 and in verse 10. So with that in mind, the woman representing the faithful remnant, here's what's said. Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then being with child, she cried out in labor and pain to give birth. 4 things are said about her here. This faithful remnant, clothed with the sun, the moon under her feet, and a garland of 12 stars on her head. I'm not going to focus on the specifics of what is the sun and the moon and the garland of 12 stars, but Harkwriter says that this symbolizes her exalted position in God's order of things. Taking in mind that if this is indeed the faithful remnant of Israel, Israel under the Old Testament was what? God's chosen people. And it's showing some exalted position here by this faithful remnant that would come. Now, what is the woman doing? The woman is with what in verse 2, and what does she do? She's with child, and she cried out in labor and pain to give birth. Well, when she's there giving birth, then we're now introduced to the second character, the dragon. And another sign appeared in heaven, behold, a great fiery red dragon. Now, there are a number of things said about the dragon. I'll bring 4 of those to your attention here in verse 3. His great fiery red dragon has 10 horns and 7 diadems on his heads. Now, who is the dragon? As we said, this one's a lot easier. Dragon is the devil, Satan. Verse 9, so the great dragon was cast out, that serpent of old, called the devil and Satan. As we said, it's one of the easier things to figure out in the symbol of Revelation, because for the case of the dragon, John tells us here's the dragon, and here's what the dragon represents. But now let's think for a second about this description. First, he's described as being what color? Red or fiery red. Some suggest perhaps that has to do with the guilt of bloodshed. In John 8 and in verse 44, you are of your father the devil, and the desires of your father you want to do. He was a murderer from the beginning, perhaps representing the guilt of bloodshed. Though that one, commentators are a little bit harder to figure out necessarily what the fiery red may mean. The other 3 are a lot easier. The 7 heads likely represent the intelligence of Satan. When you think about Satan, he is described in the scriptures as being very crafty. John 8:44 again. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in truth, because there is no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks from his own resources, for he is a liar and the father of it. 2 Corinthians 11:3, but I fear lest somehow, as the serpent deceived Eve by his craftiness. The devil is very good at what he does. He's very crafty. You think about it. I heard it illustrated this way. Go back to the beginning when Adam and Eve sinned. Do you know how many words he changed in what he told Eve? In reality, 1 word. He went from you shall surely die to you shall not surely die. That doesn't sound like a major change, does it? I mean, obviously the word not is very significant, but he simply changed 1 word. Eve was deceived. So the 7 heads likely represents the intelligence of Satan. He then has 10 horns. Now, the horn, and we're not going to trace the source of it, but we've mentioned horns a few times before already in the book. Horns are used to represent power. And so there's some power that he exercises. And finally, there are 7, on the 7 heads are 7 diadems. Now remember, we've been talking about this earlier in the book. Most translations say diadems. This term will occur later on and be translated crowns. It occurs 3 times in all the scriptures, the word diadems. It's the Greek word. The other word for crown, as we saw earlier in the book, is the word Stephanos. That word Stephanos that we saw back in chapter 4, for example, that the 24 elders were wearing, is the crown of victory. right? When we're told, when Paul talks about those that will receive a crown in 2 Timothy chapter 4, he uses the word for a crown of victory. The type that is worn here on the head of the dragon is the 7 heads, each wear their 7 diadems, so 1 per head. Diadems are the crown of a ruler. Ephesians 6 and in verse 12, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this age. And so there's, Satan is referred to as the ruler of the world. So he's there in the world trying to get us to be deceived and follow him. So this dragon has power, craftiness, and is the ruler of the world. What does he then do in verse 4? His tail drew a third of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. Now, what does it mean he drew a third of the stars? This might symbolize his influence over even angels. Now, we know he has influence over mankind, right? We mentioned some of that already. What he did with Eve. Perhaps, again, stars at times are used to represent someone of power or authority. Stars are used at times to represent rulers. Could be referencing here even angels. We know that would fit with the message of 2 Peter 2 and in verse 4, as well as Jude and in verse 6, where it talks about angels who had fallen, not keeping proper domain. Even if that's not exactly what he means, we know he has a power over and uses those of the world. We're going to get to the beast later on, and the great harlot. He uses Rome and their rulers to carry out what he wants in opposition to Christ. And so perhaps this is a reference to the angels, but at least a representative, it seems, of some power. Now, let me double check this. Yeah, Haley said, the ominous scene leads the rulers to wonder if a helpless woman and her infant son have any hope for survival. We're going to get to the end of verse 4, but at the end of verse 4, where do we find the dragon? Ready to try to kill the child. And so this scene here, we've got a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and wearing 7 diadems who can take its tail and throw a third of the stars to heaven. So the picture at this point would be, what kind of hope would this woman and her infant son have for survival? It feels kind of dark until we get to the scene that's mentioned later. But let's get to the end of verse 4 first. And the dragon stood before the woman who was ready to give birth, devour her child as soon as it was born. The dragon is being threatened by the power of the male child. Now, we don't know a lot about the male child yet. We'll get to that in verse 5. She bore a male child. In fact, we don't even know it's a male child. We know she's just trying to devour her child at this point. But this male child to be born in 5 and 6 is a threat to the power of this dragon. And so what did Satan try to do? We can go back in history. What did Satan try to do after Christ was born? He used worldly powers to try to kill him. Matthew chapter 2, and the use of Herod. And so Satan tried to destroy Christ, literally tried to kill him when he was a child. And he was unsuccessful in that. What he's trying to do at this point is, if he can get rid of the male child, he can get rid of the hope for those of the world. We'll come back to this later on, but perhaps he even thought he was triumphant when Christ died. Hebrews 2:14 and 15, Christ died the death that we die, but he showed that he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil. So perhaps Satan thought he was victorious. Perhaps the dragon looked victorious, but only for a time. Again, we'll circle back to that later on. 5 and 6, then, we have the male child. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Verse 5, this male child was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and he was caught up to God and his throne. The first half of that you can compare to Psalm 45:6 and Hebrews 1:8 about Christ and his power and rule. The second half, I think, is likely a reference to the ascension of Christ. Acts 1, 9 through 11, we have the historical recording of that. And I think as you think about Daniel 7, that it's that ascension is when Christ received his kingdom and rule, when he ascends into heaven. Daniel 7, 13 and 14, I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. Then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, to all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom the one which shall not be destroyed. Some, I believe, have described Daniel 7 as sort of the ascension of Christ from heaven's point of view. As Acts chapter 1 is the scene from earth as he's ascending up, but Daniel 7 sort of paints the picture of him being ascending into heaven, and that's when he receives his rule. So, who's the male child? Again, this one's pretty easy. It is Christ. That Christ is going to be mentioned again specifically later on. Verse 6 then, the woman flees, fled to the wilderness, and she where she has a place prepared by God. There he should feed her for 1,260 days. Again, 1,260 days is about how long? 3.5 years. The number for perfection or completeness is the number 7. 3.5 is a broken, incomplete number. This is something that is limited in how it would be. Harkwriter says in this section, the woman is now revealed in the fuller role of God's spiritual Israel, the church. The church becomes the type, the Israel of God, Galatians 6:16. One must be careful to see this distinction because the church did not give birth to Christ. Christ came of the promised seed of Abraham, Israel. However, the body of believers purchased by the blood of Christ now takes on all the characteristics of the antitype in a spiritual sense. So who does the woman represent at the beginning? The woman is representing the spiritual or the faithful remnant. But what Harkwriter's saying is we have to understand that now the church is what? Spiritual Israel. So while at the beginning it's representing a faithful remnant, that this is representative of the fact of just God's faithful people as it's used throughout here, the latter half of the chapter. We'll come back to the woman and what she suffers later on. But beginning at verse 7, then we have a war in heaven. Now, Summer says of this paragraph must be interpreted in its context and revelation rather than in relation to obscure Old Testament passages or Milton's Paradise Lost. This is not a historical account of the original state of the devil and his fall from that state. It is apocalyptic imagery to present the picture of the devil's efforts to destroy the Christ and his people. Thus, the devil has lost 2 battles in this conflict. He was unable to destroy the Christ on the earth. He was unsuccessful in his efforts to invade heaven to destroy the Christ. Now he returns to a third part of his campaign. These comments are after this section, but we're sort of getting it ahead of time. Now he turns to a third part of his campaign. He will exercise his wrath on the woman who produced the Christ. So, think about it this way with the war. There's sort of threefold in this, and again, we'll circle back to this later. Satan's original efforts was to destroy Christ where? On earth. Then that was unsuccessful, so Satan tried to invade heaven and destroy him there. Now, perhaps, and we'll get to this in a minute, perhaps this may have some reference to maybe even his death and how he seemed triumphant. As I said, we'll circle back to that. But that itself, this campaign is mentioned here. And again, we're not to think of a literal war taking place, but this is representative of this conflict where Satan is trying to get Christ. And this war in heaven, what happens? He is, once again, defeated. He's unsuccessful. So, he didn't defeat on earth, didn't defeat Christ in heaven. So now let's turn and try to defeat Christ's people. That's why there's conflict on earth. But verse 7 first, verse 7, before we get into more of the details, says, and war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought with the dragon, and the dragon fought, and his angels fought. So, we have first Michael mentioned. Michael is mentioned 3 times in the Old Testament, Daniel 10:13, 21, and 12:1. He is mentioned as in the New Testament where he's referred to as the archangel in Jude verse 9. Remember from our study of Jude, the angel that was contending with the devil about the body of Moses and said, "The Lord rebuke you," that was Michael. Now, Pulpit says in their commentary on Revelation that Michael, and they have there the Hebrew word, but it wouldn't let me paste the Hebrew word in. But in their commentary, there's the Hebrew word there. Michael, in the original Hebrew, that word signifies who is like to God. We may compare this with the cry of the worldly in chapter 13, verse 4, who is likened to the beast. In Daniel, Michael is the prince who stands up for the people of Israel in 12:1, 10:13, and 21. Michael, the archangel, is alluded to in Jude 9 as the great oppressor of Satan. St. John, perhaps borrowing the name from Daniel, puts forward Michael as the chief of those who remained faithful to the cause of God in the rebellion of Satan and his angels. So I'm going to jump ahead of us for a second. Summers mentioned this. I do not think that Satan being cast to earth in this is a reference necessarily to his origin. Now, if you ask me where did Satan come from, my answer would be I think he's a fallen angel. I think if you take 2 Peter 2, Jude verse 6, we give evidence of that. There are fallen angels. That would make the most sense where Satan came from. But this is not about his origin, and I'll get back to more of that in a minute. But after this battle takes place in 7, 8, and 9, it says, "But they, the devil and his angels," those fighting with him against Michael. And again, Pulpit pointed out Michael and his angels are representing those who are still faithful to God among the angels. What happened when they fought against the dragon? The dragon was defeated. He did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out, the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was cast to the earth, and his angels were cast out with him. So again, this is not discussing the origin of Satan, but discussing his defeat in this scene. I think, again, perhaps this could be a reference to Christ being killed. Again, we're not to take this as a literal battle where Michael and a bunch of angels are fighting against the devil necessarily and his angels, but this is representing something. I think in the efforts against Christ that perhaps, though, again, we can't really give proof of this or be dogmatic about it, but perhaps this is a reference to the fight concerning Christ being killed. When Christ is killed, Satan seemingly wins the war. It's what he's been trying to do since Christ was a baby. But then Christ is raised. Genesis 3, verse 15. "I'll put enmity between you and the woman, your seed and her seed. You shall Satan would bruise his heel, but Christ would bruise his head or crush his head." Satan seemed victorious, though he ultimately was defeated. So here's the point of this. The point of this section is not about the origin of Satan or some literal war. The point is this. If Satan had gone into heaven and invaded heaven, what hope would we have on earth? Absolutely not. If he'd have won in heaven, he would have won on earth. Since he lost in heaven, there's hope where? On earth. And we can overcome, and that's what 13 to 17 is going to point out. Now, verse 10 through 12 then is the loud voice from heaven following this battle. You can imagine the battle is finished in verse 9, this war that's taking place, and afterwards a loud voice sounds out saying, "Now salvation and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come, for the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, has been cast down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and the sea, for the devil has come down to you, having great wrath, because he knows that he has a short time." Here's the point. Everything looks dark when Satan's invading, when the dragon is invading heaven, but now he's been defeated. Salvation, strength, and the kingdom of our God and the power of Christ have come. The accusers have been cast down, and the brethren have overcome by what? Verse 11. By the blood of the Lamb. Satan may take their life on earth, but they're still victorious. Why? By the blood of the Lamb. It says then, and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. I think what the point of verse 11 is this. It's not, these are not people, these that have overcome by the blood of the Lamb are not people so in love with themselves that they're trying to focus on self-preservation, but rather they are willing to suffer for Christ. They're not so much, well, you know what, I know that I need to serve Christ, but I want to make sure that I'm okay, that nothing happens to me. I think the point of verse 11, they did not love their lives to the death. They were like what John had told in Revelation 2:10. They were faithful unto death. They were willing to die for the cause of Christ. Therefore, there's need to rejoice. Let's get 13 through 17 real quick. Now, the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth. He persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. But the woman was given 2 wings of a great eagle that she might fly into the wilderness to her place where she is nourished for a time and times and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So the serpent spewed water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. So again, the dragon failed to defeat this male child on earth. He failed to defeat him in heaven. So now let me turn to his people. I'm going to turn my attention to the woman and her offspring, which are those who keep the commandments of God. That's where he's going to turn his attention to. The woman representing those who stand for God will be spiritually protected by God so that they will be able to resist the devil, Harkwriter says. Satan then spews this water at the woman, symbolizing the fact that he's trying to destroy her and persecute her, but the earth swallows her up. Harkwriter again says the earth came to the woman's rescue through diverting Rome's attention by political uprisings, local wars, and other conflicts. If you're Rome, I want to persecute these Christians, but there's an invading force over here. You've got to make a decision. So again, here's the point real quick as we end this chapter. The point is this, that the dragon, Satan, has turned his attention to you, God's servants, because he did not defeat the male child. So now he has a limited time, verse 13. He's coming after you to try to pull you away, so that way if he can't defeat Christ, he can defeat those who follow him. Lord willing, we'll pick up in chapter 13 now on chapter 13 on Sunday morning and talk about the 2 beasts.